Bavaria, a region of Germany located on the southeast side. Overall, it was a very populated region of Germany, with many tall building-like structures. However, mainly the wealthy lived in these structures. Most civilians were farmers trying to make a living off the food they produced by selling it. These are the types of houses they would often live in, just small farmland houses just made of wood. Otherwise, the civilians would make a living off working in the mines. The conditions were so harsh there that you had to be very physically fit to work down there. The mines were full with lots of detonation explosives that would often go off at unknown times. Sometimes this would even harm some of the workers. But outside of the mines and the working, in the early 1900s in Bavaria, the idea of the American lifestyle was spreading around, rumor by rumor. The idea of living a life both made them curious and skeptical at the same time. However, despite the skepticism, many of them left their lives in search for a better one in America. But especially for the Bavarian miner Wilhelm Schleich, whose determination was greater than that of most Bavarians. However, people in Bavaria used to exaggerate about America. The rumors had labeled America as the greatest country in the world. They used to say that the streets were paved with gold. However, Schleich was aware of these American rumors for a while. He was also aware of the country's difficult citizenship process that became controversial to other emigrating people in the area. As far as he knew, arriving immigrants had to complete an identification process on a place called Ellis Island. Over time, the rumors kept spreading, and his mining conditions grew harsher by the year. Schleich started to realize the severity of his situation when his conditions even became harsher without any increasing in his salary. His considerations for emigrating Bavaria grew. Eventually, as the rumors continued to spread, and the immense hype continued to grow for the American dream, and his hatred for his job continued to grow, he would eventually become persuaded to come to America despite his thoughts on the citizenship process. So he decided to set aside his job and possibly even his family and friends to come to America. But when he discussed his departure from his homeland, money became a big factor in the decision making. Since his family and friends were not wealthy, the trip would become rather costly. At the time, the tickets to America were very expensive. He would even have to wait a few months of saving before he could go. But it was worth it, he said to himself. He was willing to wait months just to suffer a little bit so he wouldn't have to suffer the rest of his life anymore. As months went by, he eventually concluded that he would have to take the trip on his own. His family had too much money deficits and not enough willingness to go to America, so he was forced to say goodbye to the rest of his family members. Although letting go of his family was a challenge at first, Schleich knew he had to make the best of it by prepping himself for America. Schleich already heard rumors about Ellis Island from other Bavarians, even though the entire immigration process was still only partially known to him. There was also another factor on his mind. His lack of knowledge for English he knew would make it much harder for him to pass the immigration tests on the island. However, his anticipation for completing the journey had readied his mind for any challenges he would have to face going through the Ellis Island process. Upon his arrival at Ellis Island, Wilhelm was already 28 years old and became classified as a Bavarian. Prior to World War II, the classifications of other immigrants from the specific regions were stated outright. Therefore, post-war immigrants of Bavaria would have been classified as German. On Ellis Island, the clothing worn by the immigrants served as a major clue to their origin, meaning that wrong piece of clothing would sometimes mislead other immigrants from the countries of origin, which could sometimes be offensive, as if they were criticizing their homeland. For Wilhelm Schleich, it was just that. Despite identifying himself under his specific region, other immigrants would sometimes misinterpret his origin due to his Kaiser Wilhelm suspenders. And also, his belt did not have his initials on it because he couldn't afford a custom-made belt because he was a minor. This led him to assume that there would be more problems coming up on Ellis Island than he was anticipating. After failing an English test on the island, Schleich was forced to stay a couple more months to attend an English lecture. Since his class was based for German immigrants, English words were nothing more than translations. He needed to learn how to both write and read the language. However, he did not necessarily have to speak it fluently. Through immense hard work and persistency, he was able to pass it. Although the class delayed his proceedings toward citizenship, it was worth it in the end when he gained the ability to read and write the basics in English. Overall, it was a rough time at Ellis Island for Schleich. Schleich had to not only learn the language, but also learn how to live and work at Ellis Island in preparation for his journey to America. The organizers would often separate the male and female immigrants into separate classes to teach them their roles in American society. While the women were learning culinary arts and family nurturing tactics, the men were forced to take classes on physical health aspects. So he was forced to learn about physical activity. During the classes, the immigrants would sometimes do cardiovascular activities and sometimes lift weights to bodybuild. The class would also sometimes teach them about common concepts about the human body and other concepts. Since Schleich was a minor, he was already physically active at the time, so this was no challenge for him. Ellis Island was naturally a home for pre-registered immigrants with requests for citizenship. Many of them have faced many difficulties while getting through the registration process. However, Schleich overall faced more challenges than most, from his case of mistaken identity on the social scale to the increased time span of his English lectures. Ellis Island had proven to be a greater challenge than Schleich imagined. Once he had completed his registration process, he was finally granted his citizenship status. His name became identified as American. As strange as it felt at first to be identified with his status, it also felt right at the same time. His next challenge was to try to fit in with Americans, and once he set foot on American soil, he could finally witness the differences from his homeland. He quickly realized how much more urban the country was compared to his home. Since he had come from rural surroundings, urban life was foreign to him at first. So he knew that experiencing new life in the city would be exciting and frightening at the same time. He also knew that he needed a job to live as an American, because you can't make it in America without money to pay for home and food and stuff, just like his homeland. The only difference was in America, the extent was on a much larger scale. Since most of the jobs in the New York area involved industrial working, he did not have many options. When he first sat down on the streets of New York, he looked for signs of gold bricks. after hearing all the rumors that the streets were paved with gold. He was barely able to tell, even though he knew that rumor was false, because the streets were so crowded in the New York area that he couldn't even look down. All the noise and laughter in the city made him sometimes question what he was getting into. He knew that it was too late to turn back home, and that he would have to adjust living in the opposite life. In the long run, it didn't take long before Schleich was able to find work. During the time, many German immigrants coming out of Ellis Island found jobs rather quickly working as dock workers for one of the German shipping lines in Hoboken, New Jersey, just outside of New York City. This persuaded Schleich to start looking there. It wasn't long before he too was employed as a dock worker. Since Schleich was already familiar with how the steam engines work that operated the steamboats, this job will become extremely accessible for him. Producing steam under high pressure, the boiler is a big tank of water with dozens of thin metal tubes running through it. The tubes run from the firebox to the highest point, carrying the heat and the smoke from the fire with them. This arrangement of boiler tubes, as they are called, means that the engine's fire can heat the water in the boiler tank much faster, so it produces steam more quickly and efficiently. The water then makes the steam come out, and energy is produced to run the steamship to the extreme accessibility. This knowledge of the steam engine is what helped Schleich to carry out his job more efficiently. He felt like he was helping the community since the piers were nearly rebuilt just before he started working after the 1900 fire destroyed most of them. Although the intensity of this job was like that of his previous one, what was strange for him was working for the first time in a new country. But at least he wasn't longer in the mines. On his first day at work, he was unsure of what to expect. The dock was loaded with what seemed to be hundreds of workers. He did hear traces of German being spoken throughout the dock. To him, the environment sure looked better than the mines, but the real question was whether he would be able to appreciate his job more. Luckily, due to his mining experience, he was well equipped to work full-time. Over time, he began to realize the major differences between working conditions of his homeland and that of America. Although the conditions were not perfect, they were superior to that of his homeland. This soon turned his mind around on his opinion of whether he could succeed in America. Although he was unsure about his job at first, in the end he found a way to make it work. He used the money he received while working to rent an apartment nearby. His apartment was much nicer than his previous home in Bavaria. Everything seemed to be turning around for him during Schleich's new life as an American citizen. However, one thing remained in his mind. The loss of his family would sometimes regenerate his homesickness. But despite it, Schleich knew that he had everything he needed. He now had a job and a place to live. He was taking his first steps to living the American way. During his time in Hoboken, he was amazed and delighted to find so much German culture in the small section of the city. He enjoyed spending time in the German parks, social clubs, and beer gardens. The immense German social life made him feel more welcomed in America. One day, at a German social gathering, he even was able to meet another German immigrant from Bavaria who later became his friend. His life soon became busier through his active social life in addition to his job. Though he did not expect it, He added a social life to his American experience, plus many more. When Schleich was on his own and not being social, he would often peruse the city and streets of New York, looking for either fun things to do or exploring concepts of America. He would often situate himself in America and alleviate his homesickness by trying American customs, like American foods and American events. He would often go to the theaters to see American talents perform. One in particular one day was Charlie Chaplin's Walk. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen before because he never expected American talent to be so good compared to his home customs in Bavaria. He had experienced music in Bavaria, but it was never not even close to as good as what he saw in America. The way the Americans danced and performed was far beyond what he had witnessed in his life ever before. It would initiate a new change for him in his opinion of America, thus intensifying it to persuade him never to come back home again despite his homesickness. After seeing Charlie Chaplin's Walk, a few years later he began seeing more pictures from him and began to become a big fan of his stuff. The cultural impacts of America really affected his persona as to whether or not America was the greatest country of all time. He was able to draw the conclusion that it was. The talent was so superior, the food was very superior, and the people were very different than the ones in Bavaria. This overall had a major impact on Schleich. When Willem was born, he was just a simple Bavarian boy living on rural terrain with very little money. Nothing could have prepared him for what was to come during his journey to America. Its urban life may have made it hard for him to adjust to the American lifestyle at first, but after a while he eventually adjusted properly and began to like America more and more. Both learning English at Ellis Island and his mistaken identity due to his clothing had also made it difficult for him. He did not enjoy his extended stay on the island, but despite these challenges, his determination for the American dream is what allowed him to complete his journey in America through Ellis Island. While he was working hard to complete his American dream, he felt like a strong foothold in America. This gave him confidence and hope that he would one day be reunited with his family, despite them never coming. Over time, he began to write letters to his family and friends from America to Bavaria. He was hoping that eventually they could make the journey to America and after saving a bunch of money. However, as years and years went on, he'd gotten older and slower and they never were able to come. However, he had all he needed. He had a place to live, an active social life, and a good job working with other Germans. This was the life for him, and never again would he ever return to Bavaria. Unknowing to Schleich, back home in Bavaria, the hype for American dreams had grown even more rapidly than ever. World War I had almost completely destroyed the country of Germany. The people had become even more poor than ever and in need of money. Work was very limited, and there was no sense of whether or not his family or friends were alive at the time. Schleich had no idea of these happenings because he was living a great life in America. All he was aware of was how much fun he was having in America and what good life lies ahead. Although it was unclear what would lay before him at first, it was clear to him now what he was into.